Welcome back to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. This is part 2 to the Hwaseong serial killer case. If you didn't listen to part 1, I recommend going back, taking a listen, and returning. Also a reminder that we are having a movie screening of Memories of Murder on June 15th, which is based off of this case, in the Korean True Crime Discord. It's free for anyone to join. There's no pressure to talk in the chat. Just come and hang out. I'd love to watch a movie with you. If you're listening to this after that date, come join the Discord anyways. There will be future events. And of course, thank you to my patrons, Vix Mac, Lala, William White, G1 Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anamanam, Dr. Bob, My96, Lumos, Emma Brown, David Tafoya, Adriana, Pip, Dade512, Shebecca, Veronica, and Olive. You make this show possible. I know you hear every podcast say please follow and rate the show, but it truly does help the platforms recommend our show to new listeners. Right now, I have very few reviews on Apple Podcasts, so I'd like some honest reviews from any of you who are listening on Apple. Spotify listeners, thank you so much for the ratings, and if you're listening from anywhere else, thank you so much. Warning, today's episode contains discussions of sexual assault, torture, and involves child victims. Listener discretion is advised. We left off 2 weeks ago learning about the copycat killer Yoon Sung-yeol, who murdered 13-year-old Park Sang-hee. Yoon Sung-yeol was apprehended and convicted for the murder following his confession. When the police finished congratulating themselves on closing the case, they had to face the dreadful reality that a serial killer with 7 victims was still out there, potentially scoping out a new target. While they had been busy with the Park Sang-hee investigation, less resources were being allocated to the investigation into the serial killer, meaning less eyes were on Chun-jae. But to their luck, Chun-jae was arrested while breaking into a home. He tried to lie his way out of punishment, but the judge concluded that the weapon he had on him showed his intent to rob the inhabitants. Although little did they know that he was planning to rape and murder the woman inside. While he sat in the jail cell awaiting his trial, the police had wanted posters of Chun-jae tacked to nearby walls. If you have any information about the following man that leads to his arrest, they read. But he was sitting in their jail cell already. He sat in his cell singing the song Innocent by Ha Chun-hwa. Then, he was sentenced to 1 year and 6 months in prison and to serve 2 years of probation. When he walked out of the prison, holding his belongings in April of 1990, he must have felt invincible. They had him in custody, had his DNA, but they still couldn't realize that he was the man they were looking for. For 14 months, there were no more victims of the Hwaseong serial killer, and people began to relax their shoulders. People returned to a normal life, without the fear of a man lurking in the shadows of the night. But women, especially in this area, were forever changed. The trust they had in their community and their peace was forever tainted. They would never return to feelings of normalcy. The police didn't stop the investigation during those 14 months, but with their killer in prison, there was no way to find more information. And during this time, the task force assigned to the case tried to understand what kind of person their killer might be. They believed they were looking for someone in the military. This deduction came from the extended cooling-off period. It isn't typical for a cooling-off period to be this long after so many consistent murders. There had to have been a large event that either meant he was dead, had left the country, or was serving in his mandatory military service. There weren't any men who recently passed away that fit the description, and because the country has mandatory military service, men weren't allowed to leave the country permanently, easily without paperwork. The threat of North Korea was very real to them. So men who were able to serve, whether they'd completed their mandatory training or not, weren't just allowed to leave the country for no reason. It was a process. So they concluded that most likely he was serving in the military, which wasn't true, but it was their best lead. In the month following his release from prison, Chun-jae was returning to his regular life. He moved back into his home, he found a job at a construction company in Seoul as an excavator operator, and he bided his time. He had plenty of time to think about what he would do while he was in prison, but he needed more time to scope out the areas and learn about the changes in the police routes as well as follow the investigation for the case. What he knew was that they never suspected him, and he thought they likely wouldn't. In the months after the murder of An Ki-sun, the 54-year-old woman who worked at her son's restaurant, the police increased their presence in the area to try to trap the killer. There was belief that only women wearing red would be attacked, or that during all of the attacks, a certain song was requested on the radio. That song was Melancholy Letter by Yoo Jae-ha, who unfortunately passed away shortly after the release of his album. Thankfully, this song was not remembered for its relation to a 1990s creepypasta. The police did investigate based off of these horror stories, just in case they had some basis in the truth. In particular, female officers were dispatched wearing red dresses in various areas of Hwaseong at night. These undercover women walked near the rice fields or in dark alleys, waiting to see if they could lure the Hwaseong killer out. This tactic would have been effective if Chun-jae was not in prison during the time it was implemented. Chun-jae didn't stalk the women he attacked. He just waited until they were walking by. There were many nights he went out and never found someone to attack because no one happened to walk by. If the police had continued to have undercover officers in the area after Chun-jae was released from prison, it is likely that they would have caught him red-handed. He didn't wait long after being released from prison to return to killing. A month after his release, he returned to Hwaseong to find a new victim. That's when he found 14-year-old Kim Mi-jung. She was chosen to stay late at her middle school for classroom cleaning duty. Her cleaning duty lasted a bit longer than normal because one of her friends stayed with her while she was cleaning so that they could hang out for a bit. By the time she left school, it was already getting dark outside. Her friend left her at the school doors and started to walk home at around 5 p.m. Kim Mi-jung walked home in a different direction, so they had parted ways, but a woman driving home would see her just before she reached her house. The woman wouldn't have remembered seeing Mi-jung, but she saw an adult man wearing a navy blue suit enthusiastically waving her down. The man seemed like he knew the girl and was greeting maybe a friend's daughter or a niece of his. He started to jog to catch up to her and was smiling widely. Just a few minutes later, a farmer drove by and saw Kim Mi-jung standing in the same spot talking to the man. That was the last anyone would see of Kim Mi-jung alive. When she didn't arrive home that night, her family began to contact her school friend's parents to see if she had gone over to someone's house. The sun was completely down at this point at 8 p.m. when her parents learned that nobody knew where their daughter was. They couldn't locate her, so they contacted the police. To make matters worse, the family was waiting for her specifically to come home that night because it was one of her parents' birthdays, and they had a full celebration planned. But instead of having a party together, they spent the next hour calling everyone they knew in town, family and friends, to come help them search for their daughter. By 9 p.m., they had dozens of people out looking on foot for Kim Mi-jung. The police weren't very helpful in this case because they told the family they couldn't mobilize any officers after sundown. This wasn't the officers' fault, though. The country was under blackout rules. This meant that at night, they forbade any bright lights that could reveal to enemy aircrafts from being able to visualize the landscape in cities. Tensions from the Korean War didn't begin to ease up until 1991, when North and South Korea signed the North-South Basic Agreement, which said they both wanted reunification in the future. South Korea still greatly feared attacks from North Korea, but the family wasn't willing to risk their daughter's safety or life to wait until the morning to search for her. So together, they grabbed their flashlights and went out into the darkness. For hours, they searched the route their daughter walked home from school. They knocked on doors and asked neighbors. They did everything right to find Mi-jung. Unfortunately, the man who approached Kim Mi-jung was in fact Chun-jae. The man who is said to never smile and had a dry personality was the man who waved his arms over his head, smiling ear to ear, approaching 14-year-old Mi-jung. After searching all night for her, shortly before 9 a.m., her uncle was the one to find her body. She was found at the top of a forested hill near the police station. She was wearing her school uniform and her hands and feet were bound with her stockings. Her shirt was used to cover her head and was used to strangle her to death. Her underwear were placed in her mouth as a gag. The Hwaseong serial killer was back. Finding Mi-jung was devastating to her family. Chun-jae followed his MO in this case, but his cruelty was only worsening. She was found with more than 20 slash and stab wounds to her chest. The knife used was her stationary blade from her pencil case. Next to her were her belongings, dumped out on the ground. Her backpack was thrown to the side as well as her opened lunchbox. They wouldn't know the extent of the torture she endured until her body was taken to the morgue for an autopsy. When they went to collect evidence from the sexual assault, they discovered objects were lodged inside of her vagina. A spoon, fork, and pens were found inside of her. The forensic team continued the examination by collecting the contents of her stomach. This would help determine the time of death. A normal gastric emptying time, where your food moves from your stomach to your small intestine, is about 90 minutes. At her time of death, she still had food in her stomach. She had undigested japchae, a noodle dish, in her stomach, which was what she had brought for lunch that day. But that didn't make sense, considering she wasn't suffering from gastroparesis, which would have slowed the gastric emptying time. Her stomach should have been completely empty of her lunch by 2 p.m. that day. It's possible she saved some of her food to eat after school, but even if that was true, they determined that her time of death was 2 hours after eating. The undigested japchae was a crucial puzzle piece to discovering the demented mind of Chun-jae. When her lunchbox was dusted for fingerprints, they found multiple intact fingerprints from an adult, presumably belonging to the killer. Her container of japchae was open. This painted a terrifying picture of Kim Mi-jung's final moments. Chun-jae had force-fed the girl the noodles before assaulting and murdering her. He wanted to psychologically and physically torment her. He wanted to scare her and have total control over her. Each murder, he was growing increasingly cold-blooded. There's a lot of speculation as to why he chose to spend so much time terrifying this girl. And the police suspected that after his arrest, he felt wronged, and in the twisted mind of a killer, he needed to gain control and justice for what was done to him. There's a victim mentality to even the most sadistic of killers. The police had a chance to catch Chun-jae now because 2 eyewitnesses had seen him approaching and speaking to Mi-jung. The farmer even saw Chun-jae's face a little bit better than the first woman who drove by. After her body was found, the farmer went to the police station to report the man that he saw. He told the police that he'd seen the man before in town. He didn't know his name, but he was sure that he'd seen him near an electrical company and had seen him near the police station before. But oddly, Chun-jae wasn't investigated in this case. The police told him that they'd interrogated that man before and ruled him out as a suspect. We'll talk more about Chun-jae's interactions with the police, but if they had believed the farmer, they might have ended this nightmare. The farmer continued to help the family search for their daughter's killer for years to come. The news was everywhere. The Hwaseong killer was back. The problem was, people couldn't just stop commuting at night altogether. Women had jobs and cars are expensive. Public transit was reliable and cheap, but bus stops weren't on every block in this rural area, and to many people, it's difficult to imagine that you could be the next victim. At a certain point, people got tired of catering their life to being afraid, and they just returned to normal life, even if the danger persisted. 5 months after the murder of Kim Mi-jung, on April 3, 1991, 69-year-old Kwon Sun-sang made a trip to see her daughter in Suwon. Kwon Sun-sang left her daughter's home and took the bus stop to Osan Stop in Hwaseong. She got off the bus around 9 p.m. that night, and her walk was mostly along dirt roads. This area was under development and had some construction going on near the farms, but the end of the road led to an untouched forested area. She had to pass this small forest to get to her house, but Chun-jae was waiting in the woods for someone to walk by. The next morning, a construction worker went to the wooded area to relieve himself in private, and that is when he discovered Kwon Sun-sang's body. She was laying with her pants removed and a black scarf tied around her neck, strangling her. When the police arrived, it was surprising to them to find a victim who was not gagged, and her hands were not bound behind her back. In her autopsy, they discovered her socks had been inserted inside of her vagina, and there was semen present belonging to a person with blood type B. This matched the DNA evidence they had already collected. They could confirm that this was not a copycat killer. Again, fingerprints were collected. They had searched their database for fingerprints in their records, which Chun-jae went to prison. He was fingerprinted, but they didn't find any matches. Fingerprint technology wasn't perfect, and there wasn't the computer processing for fingerprints that we have today. But not only that, the police in Hwaseong were using pre-modern forensic techniques that weren't even up to par with Seoul, a city less than 2 hours away. The police were receiving heavy criticism from the public for not catching the killer. They had, over the course of the investigation, fingerprinted 40,000 men, and they still didn't have a match. It was an odd choice to not use the more advanced forensic methods that were at their disposal. But as you'll learn, there was more going on behind the scenes than people knew about. People started to resort to protecting themselves. The area saw a large portion of the population begin to move. Families with daughters moved away, some even went as far as moving to other countries. If the police couldn't apprehend the killer, they needed to ensure their own survival. But not only women and girls were afraid of the killer, men were terrified of becoming targets by the police. Rumors started to circulate that if the police thought you were the suspect, your life would be ruined. Men who were chosen as suspects had their pictures shown on the news whenever they found someone new who they thought was connected to the case. Once your picture was on the news, regardless that all of those men were innocent, they lost their jobs. People stopped talking to them, and some say that they experienced torture at the hands of the police. Back in the earlier days of the television series Unanswered Questions, which is referenced often on this podcast, since it is a staple in the true crime investigation media for South Korea, they had covered the Hwaseong serial killer. This was prior to any information connecting Lee Chun-jae to the murders. In April of 1992, they presented the case to the public that they believed the serial rapist who plagued the Hwaseong area in 1986 was in fact the same person as the Hwaseong serial killer. They brought in a survivor of sexual assault that Lee Chun-jae had committed in 1986, who told the investigative team that the man who attacked her matched the description of the killer. He swore often, he had soft hands, although she said that the man who attacked her had long hair. The investigators determined that the Hwaseong serial killer and rapist both lived in the Hwaseong area, closer to Suwon, because of the central location of all of the murders and the sexual assaults. The man who was seen with stained fingernails getting onto the bus had gotten onto a route leading to Suwon, and he got off in that area. Expert criminal profilers from America met with the production team and spoke about the killer. They said that he was likely someone who was oppressed by women growing up. The killer must have some trauma relating to women or a sexual encounter he had while he was young. They said that the killer most likely was shy or quiet in his daily life. He wasn't a charismatic man, which was perfectly in line with what we would learn about Lee Chun-jae, since, according to him, he did experience a traumatic incident from a sexual assault by an older woman when he was a child. The investigators knew exactly who Lee Chun-jae was, what he looked like, how his hands felt, and what his face looked like, and yet they couldn't find him. To the world, the Hwaseong serial killer went on hiatus again. It had been a year since the last murder when the episode aired. And that same month, Lee Chun-jae would get married to a woman who worked as an accountant at the aggregate company he was working at. Together, they had a son, but Lee Chun-jae was far from being a good father. His wife would say that he was violent and had uncontrolled alcoholism that tore their family apart. Lee Chun-jae would beat his 2-year-old son until the bruises on his body were bleeding. When his wife tried to stop him, she was beaten with a glass ashtray until she was left unconscious and bleeding. Lee Chun-jae's deranged aggression wasn't lessened because he had a family. He just found someone new to control and abuse. His wife would tell the police that he had paraphilia, which is a psychiatric disorder in which a person has culturally non-sanctioned sexual behavior. This is not shaming any unique kinks, because in this instance, it was indeed a psychiatric disorder. Typically, these non-sanctioned sexual behaviors involve harm to others without consent. Illegal acts, essentially. He only wanted to engage in sex that was rape, non-consensual. His wife wouldn't report him to the police until a year and a half later in December 1983, when she was able to escape and save her and her son's life. I can't imagine the bravery she must have had to leave him. She was able to stay with her younger sister, who fully supported her decision to leave Lee Chun-jae. But he wasn't going to just let her leave, so he started making harassing phone calls daily to her sister's house. In one of his calls, he told his wife that he was going to tattoo all over her body so that she could never get remarried. This is unfortunately a very common threat from abusive spouses, with the notable case of Lee Young-hak, who did tattoo all over his wife's body when he was abusing her. I did cover that case as well, if you want to go back and listen to it. Lee Chun-jae's violent demeanor was opposite of how people described him growing up. Anyone who knew him outside of the household would believe the lie that he was calm and shy. The truth is that he was a monster. As he continued to harass her, he called her a final time and said, 무서운 음모를 꾸미고 있다는 걸 알아둬라, which is along the lines of, understand that I am planning to do something scary now. He was threatening her for what he was going to do next. Around a month later, on January 13th, 1994, Chun-jae called his wife's sister, who was 19 at the time. He told her that she could come over and collect his wife's belongings. They'd been trying to get their things back from him for a while. She agreed, but said that his ex-wife wasn't going anywhere near that house. He agreed to that and said that he'd even help her move kitchen appliances. Chun-jae was actually hoping she would come alone. She came by after work that day, and before they started to collect her things, he offered the sister a drink. She accepted and started to pack up clothes and other personal belongings of her sister's. But as she moved around, she started to feel a little bit lightheaded and dizzy. It came on very suddenly. Her eyes started to feel incredibly heavy, and to Chun-jae's confession of what occurred, she seemed like she knew what was going on and tried to leave the house quickly. She made an excuse saying that she told a friend they'd meet for dinner and she had totally forgotten, so she needed to leave immediately. But Chun-jae had drugged her drink with multiple prescription-strength sleeping pills. As she was trying to leave the house, she lost consciousness and fell. Chun-jae didn't care about her excuse because he didn't care if he was caught from this. A killer who had evaded arrest for so long, he didn't believe he could ever get caught, even if he killed his own sister-in-law. He easily overpowered her now that she was going in and out of consciousness. It was 6:30 p.m. when the assaults began, and he would continue to sexually assault her until she began to regain consciousness. He had placed her jeans over her head and tied her arms with a pair of his wife's stockings. He took a hammer and struck her in the head 4 times, leaving a wound bleeding onto his floorboards. But that's not how he liked to kill women. So he took a second pair of stockings and strangled her to death. This situation was much unlike his previous murders, because he now had to dispose of her body away from his house so he wouldn't get caught. He placed a plastic bag over her head, which was bleeding, and he took a large blue tarp and began to wrap her in it. He secured it with straps and belts and dragged it outside, but he knew he wasn't strong enough to carry her body through the snow, so he retrieved his son's stroller and placed her on it. He would push her body on the stroller for over 1 kilometer in the snow. By the time he reached the location he wanted to dispose of her, it was 11:40 p.m. It was a factory garage that had many piles of construction materials covered in snow. He looked around the area for a location to place her and settled on a gap behind a shed touching the garage. He piled snow on top of her body and left to return home. Chun-jae started to deep clean the floor. Blood was all over the main room of his house on the wooden floors. His neighbors would say that they heard sloshing, wet sounds coming from the house, like water was being poured on the floor. They didn't hear the attack, but they heard the cleaning sounds well into the late hours of the night, along with Chun-jae's constant cursing. But Chun-jae didn't go to bed feeling paranoid or fearful that he would be caught. Except for his uncontrollable anger, he seldom expressed any emotions. When he woke up the next morning, he immediately spoke to his wife's father, his father-in-law. It isn't clear if the wife told the father about the abuse or not, but he agreed to invite Chun-jae over because the father-in-law told him that his youngest daughter was missing. Chun-jae pretended to be interested and care. Even though he knew that he had just hidden her body, he went over to help them search for her. He even went with the father-in-law to help file the missing persons report. His ex-wife's sister hadn't told anyone that she was going to his house, so they didn't know. That was where she was last, and nobody suspected that she would ever visit him alone. Chun-jae's involvement in the family's search and his facade wouldn't last very long. 2 days later, on January 15th, 1994, her body was found by the factory owner. The police called in the parents to identify her body, and Chun-jae went with them. The parents were inconsolable, and the father began yelling at the officers. That was his way of grieving. He needed someone to blame for the death and didn't know who her killer was. He didn't know her killer was standing right beside him. While they cried, Chun-jae just stood there with a blank, empty expression on his face. For a long time, people believed that the Hwaseong killer must be a sophisticated or smart man. But after his arrest, police would say he had no common sense, and his blank stares weren't of a man, sophisticated, thinking he was above everyone else. No, they were the blank stares of a man with no thought. He wasn't staring at the crime scene proud that he had gotten away with it. He was staring with an empty, emotionless, apathetic gaze. The first thing the police did was check her phone records. The last person she spoke to was Chun-jae. He tried denying ever speaking to her, saying that it must have been just an accidental call, but the call lasted way too long for that to be the case. He also couldn't keep his story straight. At first, he tried to refuse to answer police questions. He asked them, "How many years do you go to prison for rape? How many years do you go to prison for murder?" This behavior was unbelievably suspicious. The police used these questions against him in court when he tried to pretend that the police coerced his confession. So he confessed to murdering her, but said that it was accidental. He said that he confessed to preparing dozens of sleeping pills in her drink because he wanted to rape her. He thought being charged with rape was his way out of serving a long sentence, but he gave her a drink with 20 sleeping pills in it. He knew that this amount of sleeping pills would kill someone. He laced her drink so strongly that even a sip would have led to her passing out. The prosecution tried to prove that he intended to murder her because of the time it took him to dispose of her body. They brought up crime statistics, that if someone accidentally murders someone, it takes much longer to make a decision on how to get rid of their body and clean the crime scene. It only took Chun-jae 4.5 hours to abandon her body and clean up the scene. A panicking person would take upwards of 6 hours to just abandon the body. Chun-jae had already thought of his plan prior to attacking her. The prosecution brought up studies that showed that a person, when panicking, has lengthened response times and it takes them longer to perform even basic tasks. Chun-jae didn't hesitate at all. His description of his sister-in-law's final moments were telling to the prosecution that he not only intentionally murdered her, but he enjoyed it. He said that her last words were, "Why are you doing this?" He said that she could only ask this question because her body had gone limp. She couldn't move anything but mumble out this last question. He realized that his lie was slipping and he started to fixate on his story. He told the court that his wife had run away from home and stolen his only son. His sister-in-law had come over to take her things, tearing apart their family and humiliating him as a man. He said that his sister-in-law started belittling him and saying that he was a bad husband and a worse father. Overwhelmed by anger, he struck her and she died. He wanted to spin this as a moment of rage, not a premeditated murder. He was pulling out any trick he could to prevent going to prison for a long time. He knew he was most likely going back to jail, but he was trying to lie his way out of being caught for the rest of the murders or go away for life. At his September 16, 1994 sentencing, he was sentenced to death for premeditated sexual assault and accidental murder. But the death penalty sentence was commuted to life imprisonment due to the moratorium on the death penalty in South Korea. In rare cases, the death penalty can be executed, and if he had been executed in 1997, the Hwaseong killer would have been stopped. When asked if he had anything to say before being driven to prison, he said, "I'm sorry." This would be the first case in the country that had used DNA as evidence. The sister-in-law's DNA was found in his house next to his washing machine, where he most likely used towels to clean up the blood, and some of it dripped onto the floor next to his washing machine. Chun-jae had been punished for murdering his sister-in-law, but to the world, the Hwaseong killer was still out there. No one knew the Hwaseong killer would be serving out his days in Busan prison. The town stayed on high alert. Nothing had changed for them. The killer was still out there. After 2 years of there being no more cases connected to the killer, a famous playwright, Kim Kwang-rim, debuted a play titled Come to See Me. The play told the story of detectives caught in a cat-and-mouse chase searching for the Hwaseong killer, who was always one step ahead of them. The play is very sympathetic towards the detectives involved in the case with their lack of resources, which I will say is much more than you'll learn that they deserve. However, in a realistic portrayal, the police are also depicted as resorting to violent means to obtain confessions in a desperate attempt to stop the killings. The play was quite popular and had suspenseful scenes that you'd want in a crime thriller. Its storytelling would go on to inspire the success of Memories of Murder, a film directed by Bong Joon-ho. You might recognize this director because he reached international fame in 2019 for his film Parasite. Memories of Murder, which came out in 2003, sought to recreate the story of the Hwaseong serial killer, focusing on the efforts of the detectives. The film is thrilling and informative. In 2006, now 12 years since Chun-jae was sentenced to life in prison, almost all of the statute of limitations on the sexual assaults and murders were approaching quickly. At the time, there was a 15-year statute of limitations for first-degree murder. Kwon Sun-sang, the last murder before his sister-in-law, was at that 15-year mark. Even if the statute of limitations was to change, it wouldn't be retroactive. He was sitting in prison, knowing that all of his crimes were now unable to be punishable. It wouldn't matter because he was already serving a life sentence, but to him, he had gotten away with it. Because of the statute of limitations approaching, they would stop allocating resources to investigating a case that could no longer be prosecuted. So, just prior to the approach of the deadline, a member of the prosecution for the case suggested something unprecedented. They proposed that they prosecute the DNA with an unknown name. They would mark the defendant as unknown, with the DNA collected at the various crime scenes as the defendant. And then, in the future, when they found the killer who matched the DNA, they could serve the sentencing. With that method, it might buy them another 15 years to find the killer. This would have led to a very interesting outcome, but the lead of the prosecution denied the request because it might have backfired on them. So all while the prosecution and detectives are rushing to find anything they can before the statute of limitations runs out, Lee Chun-jae is thriving in prison. His upbringing in an extremely patriarchal and militant household shaped his entire life. He found solace and peace only in situations where he was confined, whether metaphorically or literally. Whether under his father's authority, in the military, or in prison, he felt at ease. He was a model prisoner and never broke any rules during his time behind bars. His days were mostly spent watching TV and sleeping. By 2009, 14 years in prison, Lee Chun-jae was appointed as a team leader, granting him responsibilities like overseeing other inmates and leading the prison factory. To keep himself entertained, he participated in the prison's Buddhist church and attended all of their religious gatherings. In 2011, Lee Chun-jae showcased his ceramics at the Prisoner's Ceramics Exhibition, where he received recognition. Lee Chun-jae's mother and older brother repeatedly visited him 2 or 3 times annually. An official from the Ministry of Justice's correctional headquarters mentioned that Lee Chun-jae was well-mannered and got along well with other inmates. He never had any issues with anyone else. But most likely this was because he was surrounded by only men. Similar to his time in the military, he excelled in structured environments where he received guidance, feedback, and accolades for his efforts. The official mentioned that Lee Chun-jae led a stable life with a positive reputation. However, when news of his involvement in the Hwaseong serial murders surfaced, it was shocking to many, even within the prison. He had never told anyone about his crimes. The meetings with Lee Chun-jae about his crimes must have been incredibly intense, as the officers interviewing him were either not yet officers or were very early in their careers when the Hwaseong serial killer was active. They lived through that terror. They watched the officers above them struggle as the killer evaded them for 30 years. The Gyeonggi Police Department conducted a morning briefing for the media, announcing the apprehension of the suspected Hwaseong serial killer. They disclosed that on July 15, 2019, they had successfully extracted DNA from the samples collected at some of the crime scenes using innovative forensic science. By comparing his DNA to their prisoner and ex-convict database, they found an extremely close match despite the degraded state of the DNA. Although they had been monitoring Lee Chun-jae for the past 2 years as a key suspect, they lacked concrete evidence linking him to the crimes. His DNA was a match for 4 out of the 10 cases. The remaining cases either lacked DNA evidence or the DNA was too deteriorated to analyze. The DNA evidence was shown to Lee Chun-jae, but it didn't shake his indifferent attitude towards any of his crimes. However, when discussing the 4th murder of Lee Suk on December 14, 1986, his wall began to crumble. Lee Suk was the first victim he assaulted with an object. He had used her umbrella to sexually assault her. The police believed that pushing his connection to her death was what forced him to confess. It could also be that he felt embarrassed that he left behind so much DNA at this crime scene. When Lee Chun-jae started confessing in October of 2019, he had a proud and smug demeanor. He disclosed about the crimes that had been reported, but also revealed that there were additional ones beyond what was already known. Lee Chun-jae confessed to 4 more murders, bringing his total number of victims to 14. The crimes that the police didn't know about or hadn't linked to Lee Chun-jae were as follows. On December 24, 1987, 18-year-old Kim Mi-soon, who lived in Suwon, got in a fight with her parents. She slammed the door and left the house, storming off after their disagreement. As she left her house at 11 p.m. that night, hoping to go see some friends, she was kidnapped near a rice field next to the nearby subway station. Kim Mi-soon was found 10 days later on January 4, 1988, in that rice field, hidden in a hay bale. She was gagged with her underwear and her hands were tied with her shirt. The lead detective of the investigation at the time believed that the case could be connected to the Hwaseong killings. There were so many similarities with the method of the murder, but the case was not included in the killings case because it was in a different jurisdiction. A police officer who was assigned to patrol the area heard that there were some teens in the area who were huffing glue nearby at 9 p.m., so he responded to the tip and found the two young men who were playing with fire near the rice field. The two, known by their surnames Myung and Jung, lived nearby and were immediately considered suspects in the murder of Kim Mi-sun. While investigating their whereabouts during the time of the murder, the officer spoke to a friend of Myung's who told them that he had confessed to his friend that he had killed someone and needed to leave Suwon soon. He told the friend, "Never speak of it to anyone." He then gave the friend his sweater as a gift. Myung told the detective in interrogation that he had given the friend his sweater in hopes that if there had been a witness, that his friend would be accused and not him. Myung was a 17-year-old local bully who hadn't thought this through. Both Myung and Jung turned on each other and confessed separately to the crime, drawing maps to the crime scene even. They said they'd threatened her with a knife, hit her with a piece of firewood, raped her, strangled her, and hid her body in the hay bales. Jung told the officers that Myung was the ringleader. He had strangled and raped her alone. But Myung said that he backed out because he wasn't having fun and he made Jung kill her. The police collected the knife from Myung's aunt's house that he had said he used it to cut her stockings and clothes. But there was another piece of evidence that they were looking for. Kim Mi-sun's watch was taken from her by the killer, but Myung couldn't reveal where the watch was. It seemed like he didn't know. They returned to the crime scene to reenact the crimes with the two boys. They walked along the train tracks, which is where the boys said they went to avoid the police. But as the police and the boys were searching the area, determined to find this watch, Myung took off running, hands cuffed in front of him. An officer began to chase Myung, easily catching up to him as he began to run down a hill. The officer reached out to grab his shirt and pull him down, but Myung tried to push the officer back, and as they struggled against each other, Myung fell backwards, falling down the hill, rolling on the frozen ground, hitting his head along the way. The officer caught up to him, picked him up, checked him for injuries, but he didn't appear to have any, or so the officer said. Little did they know, Myung had a concussion. When they returned him to the detention center, he was unattended for days, only being served meals through the door. They were extremely upset at him for his antics at the crime scene. In that time, Myung's concussion worsened, and he was found on January 12 unresponsive from brain death. When he was rushed to the hospital, he was put on a respirator, but was, by legal definition, dead. For 37 days, he was in the hospital on life support before his family made the decision to allow him to pass away. The detectives, including the lead detective, were all sentenced to prison time for the maltreatment of Myung. Now, Myung and Jung's DNA evidence was indeed found at the crime scene of Kim Mi-sun. Their feces, hair, and pubic hair were all found near the crime scene. This was weighed more heavily than their confessions, although they did know details of the crime and they were able to describe the area that it happened in. Myung and Jung were notorious as bullies, and they were known to hide out in the mountains there to huff glue and paint. This was an area they often were seen in. Jung, while in the detention center, had told another prisoner what he had done to Kim Mi-sun, and that Jung had heard that he should insist that the police tortured them to make a false confession, because there were a lot of other major cases happening at this time of false confessions brought on by assault. This prisoner snitched to the guards, but it made no difference, because in the trial, Jung was released without any charges, because Myung had died in the police's care. But on October 15th, 2019, when Chun-jae was being interrogated, he confessed to the murder of Kim Mi-sun. The police were unsure if this was a true confession or if Chun-jae wanted to tack on more crimes that he couldn't be prosecuted for. Following this confession, Myung's family asked for a formal apology from the police, but the police responded that this was an issue that had already concluded and there was no reason for them to apologize. They still believed that Myung was the true culprit, but now, with Chun-jae's confession, they couldn't be sure. It was possible that Myung and Jung were just two dumb teenage boys, high off of drugs in the woods, who found Kim Mi-sun's body and wanted to claim the murder for themselves, but then got in too deep. The police may also have tried forcing them to stick to their initial confessions, even if the boys said they didn't really do it. But with Myung dead and the statute of limitations passed, there will never be any justice. Lee Chun-jae's next confession would be for a murder committed on July 7th, 1989, 2 months prior to his arrest for breaking and entering a home that landed him in prison. 8-year-old Kim Hyung-jung was walking home from elementary school at 12:30 p.m. when she disappeared. Her parents reported her missing when she didn't come home from school, and 5 months later, her skirt and backpack were found on a hill near where she disappeared from. A year later, the contents of her backpack were found in the investigation in the 9th victim's case. After another year passed, the case was closed and considered unsolved. Her parents continued to believe for 30 years that their daughter might still be out there. They never changed their home phone, hoping that one day she would remember their number and come home. They thought maybe some lonely woman had kidnapped her, or she had lost her memories, and someday she might remember and come home. Then, on October 15, 2019, Lee Chun-jae confessed to the murder of Kim Hyun-jung. He said that he had gone to the hill to kill himself that day, but as he lingered, contemplating ending his own life, Kim Hyun-jung had walked past him and gotten scared. She started to run. Lee Chun-jae claimed he was worried that his crimes would somehow be revealed because of the girl, so he chased her and dragged her into the forest. He held her down and tied her arms with a jump rope from her backpack. He sexually assaulted her and murdered her, then left her body in the grassy area. This shattered the hope that the family had, even 30 years later. But something worse than his confession would be revealed. The police had found Kim Hyun-jung's body a year after her disappearance. When they found her belongings in the 9th victim's case on December 21st, 1989, her shoes, socks, underwear, pencil case, skirt, and a tambourine were all found next to her body. All of those items that they told the family they found were next to her body. But how could they have not connected it to the family's missing person report, and how did they exclude it from the information they gave to the family? Why reveal the items but not the body? The chief of police told his officers, "Bring me a shovel," as they uncovered the girl's body, bound by a jump rope. Then he threatened the officers present, "Never speak of this to anyone." The chief hid the evidence in a special locker, which was locked to all other officers, and he intentionally obstructed the investigation. Since this has come forward, he has refused contact with reporters or investigators. When visited, he just repeats that he has no idea what anyone is talking about. Lee Chun-jae confessed that he didn't do anything to conceal the body or her belongings. But when the chief of police wrote a report stating that he found pieces of her clothes on December 22nd, the day after they found her body, he wrote that the clothes were folded and organized, making it appear like a kidnapping. The girl's father had visited the police station days later on December 25th to be questioned again about their missing daughter. The father described the items his daughter had with her. Specifically, he mentioned that she had a jump rope with her. It was her favorite thing. He said that she never went anywhere without it. The same jump rope they'd found her tied up in. The police lied, as they told the father they never found it. The police fabricated their reports of the meetings with the father, and even went as far as to forge the father's signature so they didn't have to include this in the report. When Lee Chun-jae confessed, the girl's parents cried as they spoke to the reporters and said, "Who will catch the police? They killed our daughter twice." Lee Chun-jae's confession was credible, and even after so much time had passed, he knew details that no one knew because the case was never public. The police had not yet known that the body was already removed from the crime scene when Lee Chun-jae confessed, so they sent a team of junior officers to excavate the area, which the grieving family protested that they never put any effort into their daughter's disappearance. They couldn't even bring experts to search the area. They brought junior officers. But ultimately, it wouldn't matter because Kim Hyun-jung's body was not there because the chief of police had intentionally destroyed the evidence. The current police officers criticized this misjustice, saying that he concealed a murder to temporarily escape the burden of investigative work. The former chief of police wanted to falsely reveal her body once a suspect was found so that he didn't need to investigate the missing girl. However, they never resumed the investigation. In all, 10 officers knew and remained silent about the cover-up. The officers all said things like, "I heard that the chief of police did this or that," never implicating themselves because, they had only heard rumors. The family spoke during the Lee Chun-jae trial and stated that they believed the chief of police was worse than Lee Chun-jae. Mi-sun's father said, choking back tears, "If the police had told me she was dead, I wouldn't have buried her in my heart. If they had shown me her remains, I wouldn't have searched the mountain for her every day for 30 years. Lee Chun-jae next confessed to a crime he committed on January 27, 1991, 2 months prior to the murder of Kwon Sun-sung, his 10th known victim. 17-year-old Park Mi-hwa went missing while walking home from work to her company's dormitory at around 6 p.m. By 10:50 a.m. the next morning, she was found by an officer assigned to patrol the area. Her body was found at a construction site inside of a concrete tube. Her time of death was determined to be between 9 p.m. and midnight. The police searched the area that morning because the prior night at around 8:30 p.m., a 32-year-old woman named Kim was walking past the construction area on her walk home when she was attacked from behind. The man dragged her into a large concrete pipe and tied her hands with her stockings and clothes. He took her rings and money, and as he was momentarily distracted, she freed her hands and began to run away from the area. She ran to the main road where she hailed a taxi and escaped. She couldn't remember what Lee Chun-jae's face looked like, but Kim said he was maybe 30 years old. Lee Chun-jae was 28 at the time. After Kim escaped, she told the police she thought she saw another woman walking in the area that maybe had witnessed her running away, but she didn't look back as the taxi drove away. Kim had seen Park Mi-hwa, who Lee Chun-jae then kidnapped and murdered. But at this time, Park Mi-hwa's murder was not included in the Hwaseong serial killings because the attacker didn't gag her, and the Hwaseong case was reported widely. They thought copycats were bound to pop up. The survivor stated that she thought he was 170 centimeters and in his 30s, but the profile that they had for Lee Chun-jae was a man in his mid-20s and under 160 centimeters. A man was apprehended as a suspect for the murder of Park Mi-hwa because he fit the profile, but was found not guilty when his case went to trial for lack of evidence. The survivor, Kim, also said that when hearing the suspect's voice that it was not similar to that of her attacker. Her attacker's voice was quite deep. She couldn't be sure if he was the attacker or not, though, so her testimony was considered unreliable since due to trauma, she was unable to recall details of the crime. But on October 6, 2019, Lee Chun-jae confessed to the murder of Park Mi-hwa. Since this time, the accused man has come forward stating that he was tortured by the police during his interrogations. They poured red pepper powder in his eyes and mouth and deprived him of sleep for days. He wouldn't ever get justice for what happened to him. Finally, Lee Chun-jae confessed to the murder of a 28-year-old woman surnamed Lee in Cheongju on June 24, 1992. But the details of this case are not known to the public due to various reasons, potentially including the family's want for privacy. During their meetings with Lee Chun-jae, the police also opened a hotline for anyone who had information about the crimes now that they knew who committed them. Perhaps someone knew Lee Chun-jae or had worked with him and could give any information about the crimes. Someone had to have known something. The first credible witness came forward on September 27, 2019, and had given information that changed what they knew about Lee Chun-jae's earlier crimes. Now, Lee Chun-jae would not comment on these allegations, which is telling that he didn't want to take credit for his actions. The witness stated that in 1986, prior to the murder's beginning, they entered a public restroom in Hwaseong. The man worked late, so they pulled over in the late hours of the night, but they couldn't remember exactly when. As they were about to leave the restroom, a woman came into the men's restroom, or so they thought, from their peripheral vision. When they turned to actually look at the person, they saw that it was a man, wearing what looked like a long wig in women's clothing. After seeing a picture of Lee Chun-jae's face, the witness said that they were sure that that was who they had seen, wearing a disguise as a woman. They felt sick that they had encountered the Hwaseong killer and never known. But they'd always remembered running into the person who was dressed so strangely to them. This fits with what some of the sexual assault survivors have said, that their attacker had long hair, but until then there was no mentions of women's clothing. This may have been something that he tried only once, but he had at least had longer hair for multiple of the sexual assaults that he committed. This might also be why no witnesses came forward and identified Lee Chun-jae for any of these crimes. Another witness came forward on September 30th, 2019. She was an elementary-age student in 1984 and recalls a man approaching her as she played outside after school. The man pulled out a knife and threatened her, but she told the man that she wouldn't tell anyone and ran away. She also said that the man had long hair, but didn't say that he was wearing women's clothing. But she never forgot the man who had scared her so badly. When the police started sharing photos of Chun-jae, she immediately recognized his face, even as an adult. The accuracy of memory lessens over time, but she said that she could never forget what that man looked like. When Chun-jae started to confess, except for the 4 previously unknown cases, he admitted to all of his crimes. When Chun-jae started to confess, he admitted to most of his crimes. But then he admitted to one crime in particular that would make the police look quite bad. He was sometimes forthcoming with his admissions to his crimes, but in other interviews he was unwilling to speak. In the end, he admitted to 30 rapes and 14 murders. He'd had 52 interrogation sessions with 10 different criminal profilers. As a result, they concluded Chun-jae committed sadistic crimes to relieve his desires and express frustration. During these meetings, he was often correcting the profilers if they got any details wrong, or if they didn't have the full picture of a crime. But the police were smart. They were using a common interrogation tactic. By recalling information to the suspect incorrectly, the suspect feels compelled to correct the information, sometimes even revealing details that incriminate them or make them lose track of their own lies. It also serves to frustrate the suspect, which they knew was a trigger for Chun-jae's uncontrollable anger. One criminal profiler in specific was able to build a very strong rapport with Chun-jae. She was the only woman criminal profiler that was a part of the interrogations. Immediately, they noticed that when he spoke to her, he seemed happier and focused only on her. He told stories about his childhood and about his time in the military. They said he almost had a twinkle in his eye when he told these stories as he stared at the woman interrogating him. But even if he was willing to open up to her, he wasn't talking about his crimes. So they decided to have her promise to come back again the next day. But when that day came, she was absent and they sent in a man instead. He was so angry he refused to speak at all. He sat there silently the entire time. When she returned, he was angry. "Didn't you say you were coming yesterday? Where were you?" She gave him an ultimatum. If he wanted to continue to see and talk to her, he had to talk about the case. To which he responded, "If I tell you everything, you might get in trouble." The "you" in this case was the police. They agreed that they were willing to accept the full truth from him, and he asked for a pen and paper. On the paper he wrote, murder, 12, plus 2, rape, 19, attempted, 15. These numbers he is admitting to would fluctuate throughout the interrogations. Ultimately, there were 45 total victims. Murder 12 plus 2 referred to 12 murders in Hwaseong and 2 in Cheongju. Confirming the sexual assaults would take even longer, considering some of the victims were older women and some of them had already passed away. Since he didn't know any of the victims' names, it was difficult to track these women down. Many did not come forward for various reasons. Now that his DNA was able to be confirmed in the murders, they still only had a DNA match for the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, and 9th murder. The DNA collected in the 6th case was too decayed, and in the 10th case, no DNA was found at all. On October 4th, 2019, Chun-jae confessed to one more murder, the murder of Park Sang-hee, the young girl who Yoon Sung-yeol went to prison for murdering. Yoon Sung-yeol confessed to that murder. The police were now suspicious that he was confessing to crimes he didn't commit just to add them onto his rap sheet since he couldn't be prosecuted for them. To refresh your memory, Yoon Sung-yeol reenacted the murder. His hair was positive for the titanium levels that were consistent with the hair at the crime scene, and he fully confessed. But Chun-jae was also working in a factory that processed titanium. With Yoon Sung-yeol consistently saying he was innocent in prison, the police didn't know what to believe. This confession could exonerate Yoon, but Yoon was released from prison 10 years prior to this after serving his full term in 2009. Following his release, a prison guard who said he truly believed that Yoon was innocent had helped him reestablish his life. He helped Yoon find a job and return to a normal life. It's a very similar situation to what happened to Myung. We have the original case in which someone else was found guilty for the crime, but Chun-jae was saying that it was actually him who was the murderer. Could he be lying about his involvement in these murders? One of the most famous murderers in the world, Henry Lee Lucas, known for confessing to hundreds of murders spanning across dozens of states, was only confirmed to have killed 3 people. Lee Chun-jae had confessed to 14, 10 of which were originally attributed to him, but only 5 of which had confirmable DNA. Could he also be a serial confessor? In regards to the evidence that put Yoon Sung-yeol in prison, he was a match for the titanium levels. The method used to determine this is called radioisotope identification. This technique analyzes heavy metal components in samples, like strands of hair, and compares them to another sample. It didn't confirm that the hair was his. It confirmed that the hair had the same exposure levels to heavy metals. They did test the hair for blood type analysis and were able to determine that it was blood type B, which Yoon was, but so was most of the DNA found at the other crime scenes. He had been taken to the crime scene to reenact the crime, but wasn't able to climb over the home's brick fence or climb in through the victim's window. The culprit had climbed in through the window and stepped onto a side table and then onto the ground. Yoon was not able to recreate this, although the police just believed that he was faking his weakness. But in Lee Chun-jae's confession, he was able to draw a recreation of the victim's room, something that wouldn't have been known to the general public. But what was the most damning was that Lee Chun-jae lived only a few houses down from the victim. When he was younger, he'd known the family that had lived in the house and had been to that house before. But small things had been changed since he was a child, so Lee Chun-jae would have known that room was a bedroom when he broke in. Profilers suggest that Lee Chun-jae chose to change his MO of attacking women on the streets because the drawing of his face was so widely known now. He also wanted control over his environment, and since he was familiar with the house, he felt like he was in control of outside factors. So he left his wife and son asleep in his house and walked down the block to scope out the Bak family house. He confessed that he watched the house in the late hours of the night. He saw a light on in the front of the house, so he walked around the yard to see if there was any movement in the home. After entering through the unlocked fence, he approached one of the side windows. The windows were old and traditional Japanese style left over from the occupation. They had paper lining that could be easily ripped, so he poked a hole in to peek inside. The lights were off in this room, so he had to wait until his eyes adjusted. That's when he saw someone sleeping in the bed. They had long hair, so he thought it was a woman, so he entered with the intention to rape her. He climbed in through the window and had to step on a table slowly without making any sound. Then he stepped down onto the floor. He climbed on top of the bed, on top of the sleeping woman, and then saw it was actually a young girl. He started to press on her mouth and neck with all of his weight. He held his hand over her mouth, but as she woke up, he decided to strangle her. He pressed on her neck until she was dead. He could hear someone snoring in the next room as this happened. He sexually assaulted her corpse after removing her underwear, and then found a clean pair in her room and put them back on her. He recalled that he'd put them on backwards on accident, a detail that might prove that he was the true culprit, since Yoon said he'd only pulled them down. Lee Chun-jae covered her in a blanket and then left the way he came. He walked to the mountain near the house and threw away her underwear. He then returned home as if nothing happened. Lee Chun-jae also added the detail that he had placed his socks over his hands to avoid leaving fingerprints. When examining the victim's wound on her neck, there were cloth-like textures to the bruising. The police asked him, "Why did you change your MO?" And he flatly said, "I didn't think I had one." He never thought he'd done anything in a certain way. He said he just did what he wanted in the moment. Before his release in 2009, Yoon Sung-yeol was interviewed by KBS reporters and revealed that he was trying to make appeals to be released from prison because he was innocent. He told the reporters that he had no connections or money, and that was why he couldn't do much to prove his innocence. He had admitted that he knew the family, but only briefly because he went to school with the older brother. He knew he checked all of the police's suspect boxes. He had a connection to the family, his hair matched the titanium levels, and he was vulnerable and malleable to the police's efforts to make him confess. When asked what he meant by the police's efforts to make him confess, he revealed that his interrogator was Lee Gun-an. This name may mean nothing to you, but he is notoriously referred to as the torture technician of Korea. You could say he has a similar reputation to John Burge in America. There were multiple suicides from people he had framed as suspects and one person who died from his torture methods. Lee Gun-an's methods were so horrific that it was preferable to experience death than be tortured by him. He famously said, "Torture is an art." I'll remind you about the content warning on this case because I'm going into details about his torture methods. Lee Gun-an started with the typical torture methods of sleep deprivation, shocking people with a cattle prod, and waterboarding. Alongside this, he would do things like inserting ballpoint pens into people's genitals. He pulled kneecaps out of place with his bare hands. He was incredibly strong as well, and often would pull a person's joints until they popped out of place. He often beat suspects until they had deep bruises and then would press into the bruises with pointed objects like the tip of a pen. As he waterboarded suspects, immediately as they tried to catch their breath, he would electrocute them through their toes. Most people fainted or vomited during these torture sessions. These people weren't allowed to sleep for days or up to a week and were only given salt water to drink. It was surprising that there was only one recorded death from his methods. Victims from his torture have come forward and said that he was an extremely effective emotional manipulator. He psychologically tortured his victims as well, and it worked because they believed him when he said he would kill them. Lee Gun-an was so infamous that he has been the inspiration for various villains in K-dramas or movies. If you saw the 2022 movie Hunt, directed by Chun-jae, there is a teacher named Mr. E in the movie that was inspired by Lee Gun-an. Sorry for the spoiler. Lee Gun-an was a part of the Hwaseong case because they had pressure from the government to end the case as fast as possible. They couldn't pin all of the murders on Yoon, but they could pin at least one of them. Yoon Sung-yeol, like anyone else in this situation, couldn't have endured the torture to prove his innocence. He confessed to end the nightmare. Of course, the police have since denied accusations that Yoon was tortured, but Lee Gun-an's torture methods have been revealed. The 5 investigators who received promotions for the conviction of Yoon Sung-yeol continued to uphold that Yoon was guilty by stating that they had found his fingerprints at the crime scene. But there were no fingerprints included as evidence in his trial. They tried to say that because he confessed, there was no need for evidence to be brought forth in the trial, but there were also no record of fingerprints in the evidence storage. Yoon Sung-yeol took his case to court in 2019 after Chun-jae's confession and won. He was awarded the maximum compensation at the time, which is 1.87 billion won, or about $1.3 million US. He has since talked about the violence he experienced at the hands of the police and the stigma he has faced being labeled a rapist and murderer. This case was a catalyst for the advancement of forensic investigation practices in Korea and led to the establishment of modern DNA testing facilities. Chun-jae then apologized to Yoon and the victim's family, stating that he has learned how his actions have hurt others, but his stoic face and monotone voice seemed to tell a story of apathy. Yoon wasn't even the only one who was affected by the investigation of the case. There were so many men who were brought in for questioning or pinned as suspects in the case who faced the same treatment. Although not all of them were victims of Lee Gun-an's torture methods, many of them were treated similarly. There are 11 notable cases. The first case of police brutality revealed was that of Myung, the boy who was arrested for the murder of Kim Mi-soon. In his case files, it was discovered that the officers listed his brain injury as self-inflicted. The hospital reports showed that he had water in his lungs and deep bruising on his rear end, as well as the soles of his feet. He was severely beaten and waterboarded prior to his death. This gave even more credibility to the case that his confession was coerced by the police through torture. The second case was of 19-year-old Yoon Dong-il, who was accused of being a suspect in the 1990 murder of 14-year-old Kim Mi-jung, the girl who was force-fed prior to her murder. When the police came for him, it was very sudden. Nobody knew where he had disappeared to, and his family reported him missing. He was detained for 5 days at the local jail, and during that time, they tried to put 14 rape charges on his record, without any evidence. He was forced to write 27 confession letters for the sexual assaults. The police tried to bring him to a crime scene reenactment, but he refused to go. The DNA results returned that he was not a match for any of the crimes, but the police wouldn't release him because according to them, they knew he was guilty. So he was technically released from those previous charges, and then they brought forth new charges to keep him held. He was rearrested, tortured, and forced to write more false confession letters for another rape. This time, they brought in the victim to identify him, but she herself said that he was not her assailant. The police then threatened the woman, saying that they had his fingerprints at the crime scene, and they told her that she was going to say it was him, or they wouldn't investigate her case at all. Yoon Dong-il was sentenced to 2 years in prison and 3 years of probation because of his false accusation by the police. After 3 months, he was released from prison after appealing the conviction, but he would be forever labeled a sex offender. He also suffered for the rest of his life with the stigma of being tied to the Hwaseong serial killer case and from permanent effects from the torture he suffered at the hands of the police. Dong-il developed a rare disease called malignant rhabdoid tumors, which is rare in adults, but they are tumors that grow in soft tissue of the body. He developed these tumors in the locations the police repeatedly beat him. His doctors agreed that the torture is what caused the tumors to develop. He lost his battle from the cancerous tumors in 1987, 7 years later. There were multiple men tortured in the investigation of Kim Mi-jung's case. A 49-year-old man whose name is anonymous was taken in and accused of the crime in 1990. He lived near the victim and suffered from a speech impediment which made the police believe he must be devious. There was, and is, a lot of stigma towards people with disabilities in the world, and South Korea has its ongoing battles for accessibility and understanding and acceptance towards people with disabilities. He was tortured for days and made to confess to the murder until he was released when his DNA test returned to not be a match. It wasn't that the police cared about the truth of the DNA tests. It was that they knew that they couldn't bring the man to trial with just a confession and no DNA. Then, a 29-year-old man was arrested and framed for multiple sexual assaults as well as multiple of the Hwaseong murders. The man was very religious, so the police brought in a pastor and forced him to confess on video in front of the pastor, then sent that confession video to multiple media outlets. He later would tell reporters that he was so afraid of being tortured by the police that he confessed to everything they coached him to say. He had to memorize crime scene photos and reenact the crimes at the crime scenes. When he finally was released, he visited his father's grave and committed suicide by hanging himself. On November 17, 1990, a 17-year-old boy was stopped while walking near a factory in Seoul. This was 2 days after Kim Mi-jung was murdered. The boy didn't fit the profile for the crime, but he was walking, and to the police he seemed suspicious. When they stopped him, he had a switchblade in his pocket, and therefore he had the intent to commit robbery. So he was arrested. And that's when they discovered that he was from Hwaseong. They claimed that they saw a woman's hair on his clothes, and that was the justification they needed to begin to torture him. After days of torture, he was released back to his parents. 3 days later, they had arrested 19-year-old Kang Sang-gyu on November 20th, 1990. The police tortured him by depriving him of sleep while constantly demanding why he killed Kim Mi-jung. They would repeatedly tell him that witnesses saw him murder the girl and that they had evidence against him. When Kang Sang-gyu refused to admit to a crime he didn't commit, they began to punch him in the face repeatedly until he was hospitalized. He needed to be hospitalized for 3 weeks and was left with permanent facial deformities. A week later, on November 27, 1990, a 38-year-old furniture manufacturer was arrested and put through the same torture. He agreed to confess to the crimes but was ultimately released. After having endured torture, having his reputation publicly ruined, and being labeled a sex offender, he ended his own life by jumping in front of a train just weeks later. Then, an 18-year-old boy was arrested on December 11, 1990, and from the brutal torture suffered severe contusions to his head, back, and hands. The police gave him 30,000 won, which is close to $30, and told him, "Go to the hospital." His mother documented the injuries and sent it to the regional police agency, stating that her son had been tortured. But the police headquarters stated that her son was just roughed up a little bit, and he was just weak. She wasn't able to bring a case forward to bring justice for her son. A week after that, a 33-year-old factory worker was arrested on December 19th. He was subjected to a lie detector test, and they told him that the results confirmed he was a killer and that they had evidence against him. They began depriving him of sleep until he was delirious. During this time, he says that they taped his eyes shut and forced him to confess. A woman, hired by the police, pointed him out of a lineup stating that she saw him kill the girl. But when there wasn't enough evidence to bring the case to trial, he was released. There were so many men who faced similar torture in the investigation of these murders. Again, in 1993, 2 more men were arrested and accused of being the Hwaseong killer. A 41-year-old man was accused of 2 of the murders. They tortured him, but he refused to confess. He knew if he confessed, his life would be ruined forever. Reputation means everything in South Korea. They reluctantly released him, then he attempted to bring a lawsuit against the police. Because he did so, the police released his information to media outlets, ruining his life. He took his own life shortly after, and the reason he was arrested? A psychic woman from America had called in a tip and told them that he was the culprit. After he died, she called back and said that he didn't kill himself. His wife had poisoned him to prevent the police from knowing the truth. The victim's wife tried to defend her husband's reputation by suing for defamation, but as the psychic woman was in America, the lawsuit couldn't happen. It's unknown who this psychic woman was or if the police had just invented her, but it was heavily criticized that the police would include any religious or superstitious assistant. Finally, the last known victim of police brutality in this case was another 41-year-old man who is accused of multiple of the murders occurring between 1986 and 1992. Following his interactions with the police on August 3, 1993, he committed suicide by stabbing himself in the stomach with a knife. There has been commentary from the reinvestigation of this case about the past brutality. P.2, the head of the Hwaseong riot squad, was disgusted when these crimes came to light. He said, rather than knowing what the truth is, who the real culprit is, there was a prevailing atmosphere of hoping that someone would emerge as a culprit, and as a result, there were unreasonable coercive investigations and torture not only against Yoon, but also countless other suspects. There were many more victims in the process. Now, the history of policing in South Korea stems from a very brutal militaristic history, so there was a lingering practice from that time. Especially during this time, President Roh Tae-woo declared a war on crime in 1990. This declaration placed unrealistic expectations on the police departments and demanded high arrest rates of criminals. This resulted in human rights violations being done to meet these demands and resolve cases as quickly as possible. While apologies have been made now, these were inexcusable and unforgivable crimes. Even when the detectives revisited the old cases, hoping to find evidence against Chun-jae, most of the victims' bodies were cremated and belongings were destroyed shortly after being found. They didn't want the cases to be reinvestigated because then all of their laziness and cruelty would be revealed. In a few of the victims' cases, their bodies were cremated before the families even knew that their loved ones were dead. Most of this information has come to light because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was formed in 2022. When I first researched this case in 2018, most of this information was not known. Chun-jae has been interrogated by the police in the investigation for the murders multiple times. He was released every time. He never suffered any torture from these interrogations, however. In 2019, he even told the police that he was surprised he wasn't caught sooner because he didn't really make any efforts to hide his crimes. The police had taken him into the station to be questioned on 3 separate occasions. In August of 1986, weeks prior to his first murder, he was suspected in the rape of an elementary-aged girl, to which he later confessed he was guilty of. Again, in September of 1988, he was questioned in relation to Ahn Ki-sun's death. They even took a sample of his pubic hair to run against the pubic hairs found at the crime scene, but they weren't a match. Then again, in September 1989 for the murder of Park Sang-hee, which was ultimately pinned on Yoon Sang-yeol. This time he was let go because he was 165 centimeters and they thought they were looking for a man 155 centimeters tall. Each time he was just let go. There is one final piece to the puzzle we need to place. Chun-jae's blood type and DNA left at the crime scenes. How was he not caught sooner if he had served time in prison and they had his DNA in their system? Chun-jae was blood type O. All of the DNA found was blood type B. He couldn't have faked his DNA in the semen and hair samples. And he had had blood type analysis done. He was confirmed to be blood type O. He was not blood type B. There were 2 possibilities. First, that all of the samples, including the 5 semen samples, were contaminated, resulting in false results from the forensic tests. The science for this wasn't incredibly accurate, but they weren't going to give 5 identical false results in the different cases over the span of years. The second possibility was even more rare and is difficult to confirm, but has been tested. Forensic doctors believe that Chun-jae is what is known as a non-secretor. This is a condition that affects less than 20% of the world. A non-secretor, in simple terms, is a person that does not secrete their blood type antigens into bodily fluids like saliva, sweat, tears, and semen. Because they have a specific gene that inhibits this production, their bodily fluids and even fingerprints produce incomplete results in blood type tests. A famous case of this is Andre Chikatilo, whose blood type and semen blood type were entirely different, which made it difficult for the police to find him. When interviewed by reporters who asked for a fluid sample, Chun-jae's results did return back blood type B, once again, despite his actual blood type being O. Using modern methods, this condition is more easily identifiable and able to test without fallibility. But in the 80s and 90s, the scientific methods were just not advanced enough to overcome the lack of complete blood type antigens, even less considering that they were using pre-modern technology in Hwaseong. As of June 2024, Chun-jae is still alive. Officially, he has 15 murders to his name that he has confessed to, and an unknown number of rapes, but the police believe it is upwards of 30, bringing his victim count to 45. He remains in Busan prison alongside the former mayor of Busan and the culprit behind the Busan roundhouse kick murder. This year, he is 61 years old. If you're listening to this case, as this episode comes out, join us on Discord for a screening of the movie Memories of Murder, which we will watch on June 15th. If you're watching this later, join us for future movie events that will be posted on the Korean True Crime Discord. You can find information on any of my socials. I hope to see you there. As always, thank you for listening to today's episode. If you hear this, please leave a written review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify or wherever you listen. It really helps the podcast grow. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.